Hey guys, all right, so now we are ready to dive a little bit deeper into the wild and wonderful world of carbohydrates. Now, if you remember from the other video, carbohydrates are a scientific classification of biomolecules that includes what we commonly refer to as a carb or sugar. Okay, so I'm going to talk about these carbohydrates in more detail. So, what kind of elements are we going to find in carbohydrates? Well, if we look at the name carbohydrate, we break this down. I see carbo out here, and that reminds me of carbon. And then I see the word hydrate, which makes me think of water. And if I know about the chemical formula of water, I know that we have both hydrogen and oxygen. So we find these three elements in all carbohydrates. Now, I have provided a very famous chemical formula of a carbohydrate. This could be the chemical formula of glucose, fructose, or even galactose. And we'll talk about that here in a second. Now, we typically see an interesting ratio existing in carbohydrates. We typically find that there's always twice as many hydrogens as there are carbons and oxygens. But this rule doesn't necessarily always apply as you get into the disaccharides and polysaccharides that we'll talk about here in a minute. All carbohydrates are built from a simple basic subunit or building block known as a monosaccharide. So if you had a single simple sugar, that might be an example of a monosaccharide, which would be the monomer for carbohydrates. Now, if we look at this word monosaccharide, we see mono, meaning a single, and then saccharide from saccharide, which I believe means sweet. So you have a single sweet, right? One sugar. Now, let's look at some diagrams, right? So let me get my handy dandy pen. What would a monosaccharide look like? Well, these monosaccharides can be based 3 carbons, 5 carbons, or 6 carbons, right? So here would be a 6-carbon sugar, right? And that's a single sugar, so we would call that a monosaccharide. Now, if you remember from prior videos, if we want to make a dimer, right, we need 2 monomers. So what do you think a disaccharide would look like? We would have not 1, but 2 monosaccharides. And these 2 monosaccharides are held together by a chemical bond. In this case, it's a covalent bond, right? So we've got 2 monosaccharides held together. Now, if you remember our discussion of polymers, right, how many monomers are in a polymer? Many, right? So we would have at least 3 monomers being held together to form our polysaccharide, which would mean many sugars, right? And so typically speaking, from a dietary standpoint, when you hear the word simple sugars, we're looking at mono and disaccharides because they're rather small and they break down quickly. Whereas from a nutritional standpoint, if you hear the word complex carbohydrate, we're talking about these larger polysaccharides, right? And these large polysaccharides can have thousands of monosaccharides linked together in a long chain. So, from a biological standpoint, what are the functions of carbohydrates? Well, it's all about short-term energy. Monosaccharides are typically used by cells for short-term immediate energy. All right, glucose is the primary source of energy for most, if not all, cells. Disaccharides are also going to be used for short-term energy, but since we have more than one, we're actually going to have a slightly larger amount of energy. And then when we get to the polysaccharides, you can see that I've changed it from short-term energy to short-term storage. Okay, so cells and various plants can form these larger polysaccharides as a way of temporarily storing this form of short-term energy. So the intention is that the energy will be used soon, but it needs to be temporarily stored as a polysaccharide. Now, some organisms can actually use sugars, or they can take those monosaccharides and form large polysaccharides that they use for structural components. Now, let's look at some examples. What are some examples of monosaccharides? We've got glucose, fructose, galactose, ribose, and deoxyribose. And I have these in little stars here because we'll talk more about these later when we talk about DNA and RNA. What are some examples of disaccharides? We have sucrose, lactose, and maltose. And you might be noticing something about the suffix or the tail end of these words. They all end in OSE. That's a good indication in biology that you're talking about a simple sugar. So if you see that suffix, or if you look at the end of a word and you see OSE, we're probably talking about a sugar or a mono or disaccharide. Now, if we look down here, we've got some examples of polysaccharides. And the first two I have here, starch and glycogen, are both used for short-term energy storage. Okay, starch is typically used by plants, whereas glycogen is going to be used by animals. And then we've got these two structural polysaccharides down here, chitin and cellulose. Let's look at these in a little bit more detail. Oh, let me clear my screen. Need to erase these really quickly. I forgot my shortcuts, but that's all right. You'll just have to bear with me. Learning as I go. All right. So monosaccharides, right? Now, if you notice, there's the three examples. We've got glucose, fructose, and galactose, right? They would all have the same chemical formula, C6H12O6. And that chemical formula follows our 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, twice as many hydrogens as there are carbon and oxygen. Now, they have the same chemical formula, so they're actually made from the same number of each element. But these monosaccharides all have different chemical flavors or profiles. So we would actually call these isomers. They have the same chemical formula, but they are structurally different. Okay, so our bodies can actually use them for different things, and they react with different molecules. And again, we'll talk about deoxyribose and ribose later on in the semester. Now, glucose tends to be the primary form of energy for our cells, right? And so our bodies, we're talking about mammals, we deliver glucose to our muscles and various cells in our blood. So we talk a lot about blood glucose. Where do you think you would find fructose, or what does that word remind you of? If you look at this first part, fructose, this sounds like fruit. And fructose is exactly what makes the sugar in fruit taste sweet. Right? It's also what makes certain sugars in candy taste sweet. And then you see galactose. Where do you think we would find galactose? You're right. I see lactose. That makes me think of a very famous sugar that might be rather troublesome for some of you. Right? So these are our monosaccharides, our simplest sugars, the primary source of energy for short term in regards to our cells. Now let's talk about disaccharides. So now we're taking two monosaccharides and joining them together. If we take two glucose molecules and put them together, we make the disaccharide maltose. And this is actually the kind of sugar that we see in malt beverages, you know, like malt liquors or even a malt milkshake or a malt ball. And then down here, we've got glucose attached to galactose. And this would actually form lactose, right? The sugar that we find in milk. And then if you take glucose and fructose and join them together, you're going to make sucrose, which is the most common famous sugar. Sucrose is what you would find in table sugar if you were going to add it to your coffee or to your sweet tea. And you can see that although they would have the same chemical formula, the same number of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, they all taste wildly different, right? You would agree that a glass of sweet tea would taste sweet. And a glass of milk would also taste sweet, but not the same kind of sweet, right? And that is because they are structural isomers, right? They have the same number of elements and atoms, but their structures are different, which makes their behavior different. Now, in plants, sucrose is commonly used as a way to transport sugar, right? And so leaf cells make glucose via photosynthesis, and then those glucose molecules can be combined with fructose to form sucrose. And then sucrose can be transported throughout the cell so that various cells can have the energy they need to perform functions. Now, sometimes both plants and animals need to store carbohydrates for the short term, and that is going to be accomplished with polysaccharides, right? Now, starch is a highly branched polysaccharide containing thousands of monosaccharides, and it's how plants store carbohydrates or store short-term energy. We can find starch in tubers and in roots, right? So potato is a good example of a very starchy plant component that grows underground. So the potato plant sends those sugars down underground to be stored in the potato. And that's why you can actually take potatoes from the grocery store if they haven't been sprayed with growth inhibiting chemicals, and you can actually plant them. And then new potato plants will grow from that tuber. And the plants are growing using the energy stored in starch. We can also harness that energy, right? We can eat potato chips and we can eat potatoes, and our bodies can break down the starches, releasing a lot of energy. And since polysaccharides are much larger, there's a lot more energy in those larger molecules. Glycogen is the polysaccharide that we find in animal muscle and liver cells, right? So if we eat a lot of carbohydrates and we don't need all of that short-term energy, our bodies have the ability to take some of those smaller sugars and to store them in our muscles and liver for later. And we call that glycogen. And you can see that glycogen is even more branched or more highly branched than even starch. And this is what is stored in our muscles and our liver. So if you've ever been out exercising or running, or maybe watched someone run a marathon on television, you may have noticed that after a long time of physical effort, your muscles become weak and trembling, and you feel like no matter how bad you want to keep going, you can't. You feel like you're running on empty. And probably at this point, what's happened is your body has used all of the glycogen stored in your muscles, and your muscle cells no longer have that backup short-term energy storage. And then eventually, if you're saying maybe running an ultra marathon, you may notice that the ultra marathon runner gets lost and they kind of forget where they're going. And in extreme cases, they can even forget maybe their own address or their name. And that's because now their glycogen concentrations in their liver have decreased. And the glycogen in our liver is kind of like a backup energy storage for our brains, right? And so glycogen is really important for animals. Now, how are you going to remember this? Well, I think starch, I think of potatoes, and that's a pretty easy association. And then for glycogen, I think glycogen is why the guy can go to the gym, right? And so why can the guy or the gal go to the gym? It's because they have glycogen in their muscles. And then the last one, well, not the last one, but one of the major polysaccharides here is cellulose. And believe it or not, cellulose by mass, I believe, is the most abundant biopolymer on planet Earth, right? So there's a lot of cellulose on planet Earth. Cellulose is also a large polysaccharide made of thousands of monosaccharides, but cellulose is actually used for structure, right? So plants use cellulose to form what is known as the cell wall. And so cellulose is what gives plants the ability to be rigid, strong, and to grow vertically, right? We do not have cellulose in our tissues, right? This is unique to the kingdom of plants, right? And it's not necessarily used for energy, it's used for structure. And that's why when you eat something like celery, you're not going to get a lot of energy from eating celery, because the crunchy fiber or the crunchy tissues in celery is actually cellulose, right? Dietary fiber. It is good for your diet, helps kind of cleanse your intestines. And then the last one, the kind of oddball, we won't talk too much about this, maybe later when we talk about evolutionary biology, is chitin. Chitin is also a polysaccharide, and structurally it looks a lot like cellulose, right? And so it is a structural polysaccharide, right? Not necessarily used for energy. And we find chitin in arthropods, even some amphibians, and the cell walls of fungus, right? And so it's a really interesting biomolecule, right? And we find it in the exoskeletons of arthropods. And if you think about the exoskeleton of an arthropod, maybe like an insect, like an ant, they have incredibly strong exoskeletons, exo referring to the outside. If you think about dropping or an ant falling off of a table, that ant can fall 1,000 times the length of its body, hit the ground, and then scurry off. I know that I could not do the same, right? Our endoskeletons would not be able to withstand the impact of falling from, for a 6 foot person, 6,000 feet, right? And so a lot of scientists are putting a lot of focus and researching chitin in various engineering and medical applications. Now, one thing I do want to talk about, because why are we talking about biomolecules and why do we need to know about carbohydrates? Well, carbohydrate metabolism or glucose metabolism for people is a very important thing to understand because, believe it or not, diabetes is one of the more common prevalent genetic disorders and metabolic disorders. So certain individuals out there are actually born with diabetes, right? It would be a genetic disorder. Whereas some individuals over the course of their life, because of lifestyle, environment, or diet, end up with various metabolic diseases, right? And so diabetes is an issue with our ability to metabolize glucose. So for a normal individual, under normal situations, they would consume carbohydrates and our bodies would digest those carbohydrates down into simple monosaccharides, glucose, and then they would be distributed and utilized by our cells. Now, if our cells don't need all of those monosaccharides or glucose, our body has the ability to store those monosaccharides or the glucose molecules as glycogen in both our muscles and our liver for later. And our bodies can also turn glucose into fats to store in fat cells.